Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second Cyber Loss Prevention Forum open webinar. We're delighted this morning to be hosted by HRC Law in their offices in St Anne's Square. So a big thank you to them. Our topic today is email, the fraudster's weapon of choice. We're going to be looking at the scams, why they happen, and what measures we have in place to avoid the loss. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm John Davis. I'm a commercial insurance broker. And I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Higginbotham, who's also the co-founder of this forum with RiskWorks. We also have Miles Seacharan, who's a personal productivity expert. And lastly, Paul Kirkpatrick, who's a partner here at HRC Law. As with all the sessions, we're going to be focusing on the business and commercial aspects of loss prevention. And we set aside around 45 minutes for the session, probably take about 30 minutes for the presentation, and then around 15 minutes at the end for any Q&A. So please, there'll be a section on your screens where you can ask any questions. If we can't answer it, or if we don't have enough time, then we'll obviously circulate a full response after the session. And lastly, a recording of the webinar will be available on demand after the event. So let's get cracking. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Jonathan. Delighted to be here this morning with everybody. So we're talking about email, and email being the weapon of choice for fraudsters. Why do we say that? Well, it always starts with an email. Cybersecurity specialist Symantec, their research shows that 91% of cyber attacks start with an email. It's a growing threat. The FBI, no less, calculate global losses to email fraud $12.5 billion by July 2018. And they only started measuring that from about 2014, 2015 onwards. So that is huge. In the UK, action fraud is where most frauds get reported to. They've seen 123% increase. That's more than doubled in the last financial year. Typical losses there are £22,000 per business. When you start looking in other areas outside of business, if you're in residential property, for example, incidents like Friday afternoon fraud, typical losses there can be £60,000, £70,000, and there's usually a single consumer that's making that loss at the other end. Seen some figures recently suggesting that it's kind of 5, 6, 7% of SMEs who've been targeted by these threats. So it's pretty rife. So if email's such a problem, what's going on? Well, actually, it's the human interface to the corporate network. And fraudsters love dealing with humans. We can set all the technology, we can set the barriers as high as we like, but fraudsters will always go for the human interface. So if email's such a problem, can't we just rule out email? Well, no, we can't. We have staff to deal with, we have clients to deal with. And with all aspects of loss prevention, we have to strike a balance. So we talk about the loss prevention triangle a lot when we deal with clients, is you can be 100% secure and compliant, but it's a nightmare for your clients to deal with you and you never make any money or it costs a fortune. So we have to kind of strike a balance in between. So that there is a tolerable level of risk, there's a tolerable level of inconvenience for clients, and there's a tolerable level of cost within that. So email isn't going anywhere soon. Email fraud is rising all the time. So how do we avoid it? How do we protect ourselves? How do we get ourselves into a place where we feel safe? Now, joining me this morning, I've got Miles, who is a personal productivity expert. He's a management consultant. You deal with your management consultant, but your main focus is people. Tell us what it is that you do, Miles.
Yeah, I work for a company called Next Action Associates, and email really shows up a lot in the work that we do because we specialize in teaching people a way of managing their workflow, which it enables them to be more efficient, to be more effective, and it reduces their stress. And obviously, email is something that can be a source of stress for many people. So that's what we do. We do corporate training, we do courses. We're in London and Manchester, and we do executive coaching as well.
Okay, so email comes as an issue for your people, I guess, with the sheer volume of email that we receive during the course of the day. I think global statistics show we send or receive 120 emails a day. We're dealing with a lot of it. We're seeing overflowing inboxes. How does overwhelm characterize itself in the clients that you deal with?
Yeah, overwhelm is an interesting word. It sort of covers a multitude of things, but I think the things that jump out at me from doing the work that we do with people is that people often are sensing a constant feeling of really being out of control, that they're living in a way that they're really just responding and reacting to what's going on around them rather than really feeling like they're in control. They often have a constant sort of gnawing sense of anxiety that they may have missed something. And because of the nature of work today and many other factors, they often really struggle to switch off from work as well. So all of those things I'd characterised as overwhelming, and really the leading thing that is an indicator of this is stress, which is the biggest cause of absence in the workplace today.
Okay, so when we're in our email inbox, we're reactive.
Yes.
And if somebody asks you to do something.
Yeah, you often, what people are doing in their inboxes is what you often see is that they are spending chunks of the day just trying to battle their inbox to a standstill. And it's particularly prevalent with knowledge workers who experience this problem. They're getting a lot of information coming at them all the time. And really the source of the problem for this kind of work is that people are really trying to use their brains to cope with it all, to track everything that they need to pay attention to. And it's just not possible. The volume and complexity of everything that's coming at us these days, it's increasing. It's being driven by changes in the kind of work that we do, fewer and fewer people being left to do more and more stuff. And so the core of the problem is that people are just getting battered and bombarded.
Okay, so they're stressed. You have a methodology that you teach. What's this based around?
Yeah, the methodology is called GTD, which stands for Getting Things Done, as you can see on the slide there. And it's created by this smiley chap here called David Allen. He was a management strategy consultant in the US in the 70s, 80s. And he really noticed that management teams were coming up with big plans and big ideas, but often struggling to implement them because they were experiencing, even back then, just getting overwhelmed by the amount of stuff coming at them. And that was before email even came along. So his work, and really his life's work, was to study what was going on. He spent 30 years researching this in the course of his work. And in 2001, he published his ideas in the form of this book. And what the book outlined for people was a comprehensive way of really living and working, and it contains best practices around managing workflow. And he was quite lucky, hence the smile. He published it in 2001, which is when the internet was really taking off, and so were smartphones. And the problem of overwhelm was really escalating exponentially, and it was really the start of a world which no longer had any boundaries. So it's gone on to sell several million copies and become a really kind of global phenomenon.
Okay, so I'm something of an advocate of this method, and it's certainly what it does is it gets you thinking about prompts that you get when you open your inbox. And by thinking differently, you are behaving differently with the requests that you get. Now, it's based around a workflow. We keep coming back to that, and we've got a simplified version of the workflow here. Do you want to step us through it, Miles?
Yeah, sure. So what we're looking at here is one part of the GTD workflow management process. It's called a clarifying process. And so this is what we recommend when people use when they are basically looking at new stuff that's come in. So that can be emails, but it can be meeting notes, it can be texts, it can be thoughts that you woke up with in the morning. So using email as an example, I'm starting over on the left. When you open an email, you ask yourself quite naturally, what is it? You need to read it, understand what it contains, etc. And then you have to ask yourself, is it actionable? And that takes you in one of two directions over on the right, in terms of what you then do with it. Down the bottom, if it's not actionable, then you may just hit the delete key. You may file it away if you want to keep it for potential future reference. Or there's a thing down the bottom called incubating, which is where you, it's not something that you want to do now necessarily, but you want to park it so that you're not keeping, thinking about it on an ongoing basis. But up near the top is where we're going to focus really, because that's when something is actionable, when there's something you need to do to move something forward. There are three options up there. The first one, where it says do it, is a very powerful and simple rule called the 2-minute rule. It's often something that works magic quite quickly for people. Further up, delegating, obviously giving it to somebody else. And then really where we want to be is deferring, because that's when emails bring you something, the action is yours to carry forward. You can't do it quickly, so you need to actually park it in a place where it's going to wait until you're ready to do it. So this really is the bit that sort of relates most to what we're discussing. So if you took an example of an email which contains an invoice, which I know we're going to sort of talk about, then if that is, you recognize that that's something needs to be processed, then you'd end up at the top there, deferring it. You'd be putting it into a specific place with other things like it, and parking it there till you're ready to come back to it and deal with it later, clearly and systematically and safely. And really, the point of this is that you're separating the processing from the actual doing, so that you're not just processing these things on the fly as they're coming at you. You're not working really under pressure and just, as I say, battling your inbox, because the stress of doing that, it really leaves you in a very distracted, kind of weakened state with low cognitive horsepower, and that's where the risk, as you're going to go on to talk about, really, that's where the risk exists. So this is one part of a whole bunch of habits, but really it's just designed to leave you in a place where your head's clearer, you're just making better decisions, you're less stressed, and crucially, from the perspective of what we're talking about today, you're less likely to be prey to the kind of human error that fraudsters prey on.
So I'm going to dwell on that phrase, cognitive horsepower. Let's think about what fraudster does. Fraudsters subvert processes, and they get us to, well, we're not thinking straight. When we haven't got our process of how we deal with email right, we're overwhelmed, we're thinking quickly, we're stressed, our cognitive horsepower is low. So our defenses are well down. You send me a link, I'll click on it. Yep. Is when we've got ourselves into an orderly fashion, we're processing work, we're thinking about what we're doing. So then it's about having processes in place that enable us to think through what it is that we're doing. So if we're processing a document that is asking for payment, we're verifying that it's come from the right place, that it's doing that. If we're trying to do that in and amongst answering emails from all and sundry, that's when we're absolutely susceptible. So what we're going to have a look at now is the anatomy of a scam. Now this is a scam that was discovered late 2017. The analysis was done over the first quarter of 2018. There's an awful lot of documentation on this on IBM X-Force Iris's website. The link is on here, and we will publish a set of slides. I've also kind of laid this out on the Vault Connect website as well. But this is something that is absolutely getting people while their cognitive horsepower is low, but then creating a whole sophisticated scam around it. So first of all, they had to break in. Now, what they did was they targeted Microsoft 365 users. Why did they target Microsoft 365 users? Well, not because it was easy to get in, but because we have a web login to how we get into it. It's prevalent, it exists in a lot of areas, and you then started to get into a whole bunch of stuff underneath it. They used a DocuSign link to do it. So anybody who's had to sign off documents, and the way that they did it is you access the DocuSign link by logging in with your Microsoft details. Anybody who followed that link and logged in with the Microsoft 365 details had just handed the fraudster the access to their inbox. That sounds like the beginnings of a scam itself, but that's only the start of it. Once they were into the email network, fraudsters then identified the contact contacts who issued and received invoices. They started analysing the patterns of communication, the language that was used, the processes between clients and suppliers. They set up rules in the individuals' inboxes so that replies to specific emails bypassed their inbox and appeared in a folder that the user wouldn't readily find. So they've now set up a pretty complex scam. And that is, the analysis says that they think that this went on over several weeks across a good number of companies. Now, the sting happened in a number of different ways. Some of it was what is known as CEO fraud, which is actually an email comes from the big boss saying, we forgot to pay a new supplier. Can you set this up and pay this invoice? But this is the kind of thing that is people are getting more and more aware of. This particular sting is a clever one. It uses classic deception. It was an email from a genuine contact, a genuine supplier, warning that their bank account had been hacked about 2 or 3 days before they were due to pay outstanding invoices. Again, picked up from the patterns in the inbox. The instruction was quite simple. It is, because we've been hacked, don't pay any outstanding invoices. A few days later, the all clear was given, and that's then a credible reason for those bank details to have changed. Is so we're doubly sure we've updated our bank details. Please pay any outstanding balance into there. Payment was made to the newer bank account, which of course belonged to the fraudster. What happens when the money hits that account is that money is bounced then across several accounts, is laundered across the banking network, and it's gone. That is taking people who are working in their inbox, creating an elaborate scam, subverting processes that we know we've got. There's even evidence in some cases that they're subverting verification processes, but that is dealing with people who are just responding to how their email is. If you have a process that relies on email, it can be subverted. So I'm delighted to have sat with me this morning Paul from HRC Law. You've got some experience in this very field, but before we go into that, do you just want to tell us what your role is here at HRC Law?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'm a partner in the dispute resolution team here at HRC. We deal with all kinds of commercial disagreements, and our focus is to resolve those as painlessly and cost effectively as possible. Just moving on to our experience in this area, we get contacted about a wide range of disputes, often including fraud. And over the last few years, we've experienced an increased number of incidents of cyber fraud. As Richard and Miles have alluded to, invariably those scams that we've seen involve the exploitation of the vulnerability of email. Usually, I would say that the losses that our clients incur are around that average number. But actually, last year we had an instruction where the losses exceeded $600,000 US. So wow. a major hit.
So I imagine that the client in those circumstances, $600,000 is not an insignificant amount to any organisation.
No.
Is that causes a fair amount of pain. I dare say some embarrassment for the executives of that organisation as well. And I'm right in saying is they've spent that money with the fraudster. They've got a supplier still waiting to be paid.
That's right. So in this example, it actually followed almost perfectly the anatomy of a scam that Rich just drawn out, and the break-in, the setup, and the sting. It was a classic case of invoice fraud, where the email of our client's supplier had been infiltrated. That's the break-in. As things stand, we don't know how that happened. We haven't got to the bottom of that. But the fraudster did exactly what Richard talked about in following patterns. Once they infiltrated the email system, observing the email traffic between client and supplier to understand the ebb and flow of the financial relationship to educate themselves, so that when it came to the sting, whereby the fraudster had masqueraded as financial director of the supplier, and persuaded one of our clients' finance clerks to send money to another account, as has been alluded to through the course of today, with the email traffic, with the overwhelm, with the amount of stress that certain individuals within an organisation are under. The scam itself was, or the line was, that there was an audit taking place, which meant that the usual account details couldn't be used. They were being audited and therefore locked out. Please use this alternative. Unfortunately, the finance clerk, who was relatively junior, and we can come on to that, sent the monies. And it was only when the supplier, the genuine supplier, contacted our client saying, "Where's the payment for our invoices?" that the fraud became exposed, and it uncovered what had happened. Ultimately, the advice to the client, in general terms, was you have a limited number of options here, and the prospects of recovery of the monies that you sent are low.
So let's have a look at this. Is if I put myself into the shoes of that client, I put myself into the financial director or chief financial officer's shoes, I'm starting to feel very nervous about this here and now. So what are my options for recovery? Is a member of my team has just actively used all their own credentials, following the normal procedure with the bank, to make a payment to a third party. We did it. So have I got any options for recovery?
You have options. Whether they result in recovery is a different question. And the general rule here, which we'll come on to later, is this is trying to react to a situation that's happened. And the better way forward is proactivity, but we can talk about that. The options probably revolve around the various stakeholders, if you want to call them that, in the fraud. So whether you're looking at the bank, whereby it is very difficult to recover money from the bank. There are ways of obtaining certain information from the bank. There are ways of freezing the bank account in question, but they are very expensive and they are unlikely to result in a recovery. And certainly with regard to freezing a bank account, you need to act extremely quickly, and by that I would mean in a number of hours, and whether that's even feasible. So it's expensive, it's unlikely to result in a payment, and as things stand, the burden of cyber fraud sits on the parties, and unless the bank has acted dishonestly, which is usually very unlikely, then that's the case, and they won't be paying out. You've obviously got another, the fraudster, the criminal, and they're usually long gone. The money has usually been bounced, not only from the account that it was sent to, but probably once, twice, 3 times through, so that the money, the stolen money, is very difficult to trace. The individuals themselves will be very difficult to trace as well. They tend to be very sophisticated. The whole thing's been set up. That's not to say you shouldn't contact the police, or action fraud in particular, you should. And recovery is possible, but all the statistics that I've worked with absolutely endorse what we said at the outset, that recovery is low. Then next, you've got the supplier. It's an interesting angle. Maybe just talk about this a bit more in a moment. But the supplier who is expecting their money is also to blame for what's happened to a degree, in that probably it was their email systems, or their systems as a whole, that have been infiltrated. Equally, it's the client or the victims has sent money to another account, so there's blame on both sides. It raises a commercial issue, which we'll come on to. And then finally, you have the possibility of an insurance claim, whether that be your own insurance, whether you have the cover, whether the cover would respond. They're big questions. They're questions that we should be thinking about more widely about all of this. And I guess there's also any insurance that the supplier might have in place.
Okay. So that whole angle around the supplier is worth thinking about, because if we think about how we set about to protect ourselves, we've got to, if I'm reading this correctly, there's a situation here where I'm the client. I've just actively made a payment to a criminal. That money's long gone. I'm now left with a liability, a loss there, and a liability with an existing supplier for goods and services rendered. So we say that there could be an angle there because actually the breach was with the supplier.
Well, there's probably a number of breaches. And if you take the bank out of the equation and the fraudster out of the equation, and let's say insurance doesn't respond, then you may be left with the supplier. And actually, it might be your best route in trying to mitigate, reduce your exposure here. So as you said, Richard, the client in our example, they paid out $600,000 US. That had gone, disappeared. The supplier, they were $600,000 US down. So there's some big numbers involved. And whilst it will be precarious and difficult, and it will depend on the kind of the commercial relationship and the nuances and the relative bargaining powers of client and supplier in that situation, I think there is scope to open a dialogue with the supplier to talk about the situation, to educate both parties about the situation. Both parties have been duped in one way or another. Both parties probably have blame to one extent or another. And therefore, it's trying to have that constructive discussion as to how do we, as a trading relationship, deal with the situation we are actually both in. And that's difficult. There's no doubt about it. But looking at how the hurdles when you are a victim of this kind of fraud, it's slim pickings in terms of where you go to reduce your exposure. But sharing the pain of the losses may be one with your supplier. I think there are more disputes coming in this area between supplier and clients, or to the two parties, and they may still represent the best prospects of recovery. But it will always come down to a cost-benefit analysis. And I think one of the driving forces will be the quantum, the amount that you have been defrauded. With $600,000, there's reason to spend money on lawyers or internally spend the time to go to see what you can do. For $20,000 or pounds, maybe not, who knows? But supplier is definitely an angle.
So there is a real risk here, which is sitting here as someone with commercial responsibility for an organisation, is you have risks in a couple of areas here. You have fraudsters are trying to target us all. As a client, you are only as secure as your weakest supplier. So if your supplier gets compromised, there's a chance that the fraudster can perpetrate fraud using their details. But also, if you don't have your act in order, there is a chance that you could, one, lose out on payment for goods and services rendered, but actually you could find yourself embroiled in a complex negotiation with a client over their loss and yours. Now you have some advice for what to do in the event that you do fall victim.
I think guidance really here, and the key phrase is prevention rather than cure. And I've actually jumped ahead there because I think that is actually the most important thing you can do to protect your business. And what does that mean? Well, cure, as we've just looked at, is very expensive, time-consuming, and low prospects of success. It looks a bit bleak, doesn't it? And when you have to give that advice to a client, and you sort of would have liked to have been in their shoes before any of this happened, and that's where we are. And what's part of the point of today is because it's about education of your own employees, your staff. I think identifying and being able to spot those occasions, those red flag occasions, and educating all the way through the business where how these things can come about, and even when it looks genuine, being asked to change bank account payments to bank accounts is a massive red flag. Discussions with suppliers, how robust are their systems, having that dialogue with them. But then, yes, if it happens, then the key word is rapid response. Act quickly, because you might have a very short window to minimise the damage being caused, to freeze the bank account, or to get in touch with the police, or whatever, whichever, probably all ways to try and minimise the damage. And yes, get advice, and legal advice may help. Low cost initial steer on what you should be doing. It may help you save money. It may help you recover, but it will put you in an informed position to know how to deal.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Thank you. And so we've got a summary here of takeaways of dealing and protecting yourself against the weapon of choice. We have to understand that email is a human interface. Email is also inherently insecure. I've had it described to me in the past by security experts as akin to sending a postcard written in pencil. It's readily interceptable, it's readily editable. So email is definitely a challenge. Fraudsters will always target humans. It's as old as time. It's magician's tricks. Is I create a deception over here, divert your eyes away from what's really happening, and I can operate the sting. We're particularly fallible, and absolutely, using Miles's word, when we're on low cognitive horsepower, we've all been there. But the request comes through in an inbox. If we're trying to do it from our inbox, we're not thinking about what it is. I will ask you all now is how many of you know how to check the header information of an email to check that the email address that it looks like it's from is actually the email address that it's from? If I then add to that and say in the middle of a working day, how many emails do you actually do that with? Few, if any. Fraudsters know this. That's why they can spoof email addresses, why they can spoof domains, and why they can get away with it. Fraudsters target weaknesses in process as well. If you are receiving payment requests, instructions, and you deal with them purely on face value, then that's an opening that they will use. But just because you then say, well, actually, if somebody says that I'll change bank details, then I'll put in a telephone verification step. I can set up a non-geographic telephone number today. I can divert it in hours. If somebody is going to spend 2 weeks analysing the patterns of conversation and set up a sting that involves steps over a few days, be aware that it could equally involve a step to look at verification. Therefore, look at your process and procedure in light of how a fraudster could target it. If it's heavily reliant on email, if it's heavily reliant on information that has changed hands by email, then you have a risk. Think about steps that you can put in place around it. Plan for the known scams. Think about the worst case. Also, and taking Paul's advice, where can you go to recover? Are there steps that you can put in place with your suppliers, with your clients, that mean that you are less exposed to where the blame lies, that would mean that in any case where you had to recover funds, you'd have a better case for doing it. So that's the end of the presentation. I have one question that's come up here this morning. I think I can actually see a few people I'm going to ask this question to. Is the question that's coming here is, we have a footer, we have a disclaimer in our footer that says that we will never request payments by email and we will never pass payment details by email. So is this actually a protection? I've given you the disclaimer, so I guess I'll ask the lawyer first.
I think all it does really is gives you an additional argument, and when you're looking at the question of blame and how the parties divvy up that blame, it gives you an additional argument to simply say, well, it was on our disclosure, it was on our email, there was a disclaimer there. So I think it gives you another hook to make arguments on. I'm not sure it changes the ultimate liability question.
Yeah. I'm going to ask the personal productivity expert here is do you think a disclaimer is going to change someone's behavior in an email?
I don't think it'll change the core fact that we've been talking about, which is that when people are in their email, they are generally looking at the count of the things at their inbox. They're generally thinking about when the next meeting is coming along. They're trying to get through the inbox as quickly as possible. If they do have a life of back-to-back meetings, they're often trying to process their inbox at 7 o'clock at night or possibly later. And a lot of what people are doing in their inbox is that they're just really not focused. And so any of the information that's coming in there is going to be a bit shaky. So it's really not about the information that's in the email. It's about the condition, the mental condition that people are in when they are trying to do this. Because generally speaking, what most people try to do in the face of overwhelm is just work harder and faster. And it doesn't work well.
Yeah. I have another question in, which is there a listing of known scams? There are. I have one on the Vault Connect site. Is we've done some work into kind of picking out some of the known email scams. Other places that you can go to keep yourself abreast of this are Action Fraud, are very, very good at giving you notification on new scams. Presented at our last forum webinar from the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit, they published an email this morning, which I've only had a chance to have a brief look through, which tackles email scams. They have a long list of known fraudster activities that they've come across. They've also in this email provided some very useful technical advice on stuff that you can do to protect yourself from spoof emails. I guess the reality of fraud is it is a constantly evolving threat. So just because you know what the threats are today doesn't mean you are protected 2-3 months from now. It's something to keep abreast of. I myself, because it's our bread and butter, have numerous web alerts set up as we start to see scams. But I guess that's a long answer, but Action Fraud, definitely. Northwest Regional Organised Crime Units, so crime enforcement. CIFAS, which is the UK fraud authority, they publish periodic reports. And UK Finance, if you are dealing more business to consumer than business to business, UK Finance keep you up to date with what they call push payment scams and the way that they have come about. There's a particularly prevalent one in residential property known as Friday afternoon fraud, where the fraudster strikes on the Friday afternoon that you're looking to complete the house and you're in low cognitive horsepower, high stress, you want the keys of the house tonight. If you receive an email in that state saying, can you make your deposit payment to this account? It's frightening the number of people who do that, and the sums are enormous. Just looking to see whether we've got any more questions coming through. Is one of the questions that I wanted to just pose to our insurance expert here, which is if a member of your team actively makes a payment to a criminal's account, is there any recourse through insurance?
In short, assuming you've got a solid policy with a solid policy wording, then yes, there's no reason why the insurer shouldn't pay. Of course, there's going to be additional costs, as Paul's talked about. We're going to have legal fees. You're going to have IT forensic, and a load of other hidden costs as well. I suspect when it comes down to the breach, as Paul said, there'll be an aspect between you and your supplier as to where the blame lies. But a solid insurance policy should certainly look to indemnify you for some of those for those risks, if not all of them. And again, going back to what Paul was saying earlier, a good bit of advice would be when you're engaging with your supply chain is to ask what insurance they've got in place as well. And having that conversation before an incident occurs is certainly going to put you in better stead than after the event, where you can get into sort of a whole load of legal wranglings and potential arguments, I suppose.
Yeah. And knowing what the scams are in advance means you have a better chance of specifying the cover that you need before it starts.
And I suppose the more processes you've got in place, the less you pay on the premiums. It's that simple, I suppose. If you have security, you have training in process, the insurer is going to be more inclined to give you the cover that you require.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to Miles, and thank you to Paul. Thank you again to HRC Law for very kindly hosting us this morning in central Manchester. It's been very pleasant. If there are any more questions that come up to you afterwards, any concerns, please send in any questions that you have. I guess the best email to get that to would be richard@vaultconnect.co.uk. This has been the second Cyber Loss Prevention Forum webinar. We already have plans for February and March, and this will become part of a growing forum that we will continue. As ever, all of the content will be non-technical where possible. As I hope we've managed to get across this morning, it's humans that get scammed, it's cyber that enables it. So to borrow a cheesy catchphrase, don't have nightmares. I hope that's been useful. Many thanks. Have a good day.